I've been covering the Obamas since 2007, and the reason I ultimately decided to write this book is that I wanted to capture something that I felt I could not capture in 1,100-word articles. When I first started covering the Obamas, they really were Barack and Michelle. They were unusually ambitious, but they really were regular people.
Good evening. Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. I'm Barbara Perry. I'm a senior fellow here at the center in the Presidential Oral History Program. Early this month, I was watching MSNBC, and I saw an interview with Jodi about her book, The Obamas, which was to be released the next week. The interviewer asked, "Is there anything new in the book?" Jodi smiled and responded simply, "Oh, yes." With that tantalizing tease, she added, "You'll have to wait for the book, though." As an occasional scholar of first couples, from the Madisons to the Kennedys to the Clintons, I couldn't wait to read Jodi's study of the current precedent-setting pair in the White House. So when I was asked to host her forum, I eagerly accepted. Little did I know what a stir this book would provoke, prompting the First Lady immediately to do a CBS interview with her friend Gayle King to explain that she, Michelle, is not an angry black woman. Of course, a careful observer might question the wisdom of appearing on national television to express some anger over being portrayed as angry. The simplistic label of angry black woman is not the theme of Jodi's book. Rather, she explores the complexities of Michelle and Barack as individuals, as a couple, as parents, as campaigners, and finally, as occupants of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Moreover, she captures the essence of contemporary politics, particularly how it intersects with the Obamas' personas. Jodi is uniquely qualified to undertake this fascinating examination. A native of New York City, she received her undergraduate degree from Columbia. She then attended Harvard Law School briefly before leaving the dark side and following the light to journalism, starting at online magazine Slate. Subsequently, Jodi became the New York Times' arts and leisure section editor virtually as a child prodigy. She moved on to cover politics, especially the 2008 presidential election, when she focused on features about candidate Obama, his wife, and family. In the fall of 2009, she published a New York Times Magazine cover story after an Oval Office interview with the first couple. For her book, The Obamas, Jodi conducted more than 200 interviews with 33 current and former White House officials and staff and cabinet officers, as well as the Obamas' friends, relatives, neighbors, and associates, and the President and First Lady. They, along with Jodi's engaging prose, bring this story to life. No wonder the book is climbing the bestseller list. I guarantee that you will find this East Wing, West Wing intrigue an informative and compelling read. Please welcome Jodi Kantor to the Miller Center.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be here, and I want to thank the Miller Center for the invitation and thank all of you for coming tonight. You know, the normal life of a reporter goes something like wake up in the morning, take small child to school, go to the office, make phone calls, maybe somebody calls you back, maybe they don't, take subway home at the end of the day, reheat dinner, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a welcome and really fun departure and a chance to really share the story that I've been working on for 5 years. I've been covering the Obamas since 2007, and the reason I ultimately decided to write this book is that I wanted to capture something that I felt I could not capture in 1,100-word articles. Love the New York Times as I do, which is that I was watching something that I think of as the big change. When I first started covering the Obamas, they really were Barack and Michelle. They really were. They were Chicagoans. They were unusually talented, they were unusually ambitious, but they really were regular people with pretty regular lives. And the thing that I started to see first during the presidential campaign, but especially when I started to report in the White House, was how utterly the presidency was transforming their lives. the way the presidency touched every single part of their existence, it seemed to me. And it didn't only seem to me a private story, because I also saw how those changes had consequences for the rest of us. The strange thing about the presidency is how incredibly personal it is. Habits and patterns and quirks that would not matter in a normal job, that probably don't matter in the jobs that you have, really do matter in the presidency and can even affect the nation. The other thing I knew about the Obamas that formed the basis for this book is that I knew that these were two lawyers who had been passionately debating ideas for a long time. As Michelle Obama has said, about her husband, we can argue each other into a corner. And I knew that they had been debating two questions in particular. How much change can be accomplished through the political system, and how livable can political life be? And they had been debating these two questions from really the very start of their relationship. And I thought that, and so to me, part of the reason to write about their partnership is that those two questions are important questions for us all. They're questions for our country. They're questions for the future of our political system. So with that, I want to leave plenty of time for your questions and for discussion. So I just want to go over 4 of the things that I discovered in the course of my reporting for this book. And the first one seems like almost a heretical idea to raise at the Miller Center here, because the center is so filled with fabulous White House history. And yet there's something I want to say tonight that I've really been stressing in my appearances, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge, which is that our kind of glamorized images of the White House, the way we think of state dinners, Air Force One, beautiful pictures we've seen of past presidencies and the current one, I don't believe are really accurate. The White House is certainly grand. It's certainly historic. The sort of sense of American power does fill the place. And yet it is a really hard place to function and a really hard place to live. And things are changing there very, very fast. We all remember seeing Bill Clinton run in public parks during the presidency. Remember the famous shots of him bouncing up and down in his shorts? That life is no longer available to a president. In the post-September 11th era, presidents aren't allowed, sort of casual, spontaneous access to public parks. I found in my reporting that the life that the Obamas lead inside the White House is really confined and really restrictive. And once you get beyond the beautiful images, not that glamorous. The first family went to the Corcoran Gallery last night. I don't know if any of you saw it in the news or the pool reports. And that reminded me of a story about Michelle Obama and the Corcoran Gallery of Art, which is that she went there well into the administration for the first time, and she was shocked to discover that it was only a block from the White House, because the First Lady, who was such a neighborhood person in Chicago, really can't move around freely as sort of a regular citizen anymore. She said that she's taken to exercising twice a day in the White House to make up for all of the steps that she doesn't take. Has anyone here been on a White House tour? Yeah, okay. So there's the beautiful garden in the back called the First Lady's Garden that Jackie Kennedy originally planted. The First Lady doesn't use the First Lady's Garden because there are tourists back there and White House officials and cameras. And, there's a sense in which they sort of can't even use the property fully. And the reason I raise this is not simply as kind of a lifestyle issue with the presidency, but I really think it's connected to an important issue we have to begin thinking about realistically as a country, which is that there is a problem with pretty much all modern presidents in terms of their being very cut off and very isolated in the White House. To me, the signal story about Obama involves his BlackBerry. This is a guy who revolutionized online campaigning in 2008. And while he did that, he also had a BlackBerry, just like everybody else. And he kept in touch with hundreds, maybe even thousands of people on his BlackBerry. And it was a great way his aides from the campaign say of him getting spontaneous feedback and corresponding with people, getting reaction, hearing what people thought. When he got to the White House, not only did they take away his BlackBerry, they gave him this kind of hack-proof military facsimile, but they also limited the number of people who he could correspond with. He can only correspond with 10 or 15 people by email for both legal and security reasons. And so, as I began to learn these stories from aides, I said to myself, this is so emblematic of the presidency's strange combination of power and powerlessness. How is it that this president holds the nation's nuclear codes, but we don't give him the same access to electronic communication that we would afford to a 17-year-old? And forget about Republicans or Democrats, no matter who's the president, if this were some sort of executive leadership training seminar, wouldn't we say, are we really giving this person all of the tools he, or maybe one day she, needs to succeed in the presidency? And so if you get a chance to take a look at the book, you'll see that it's full of these stories of these two people who really used to sort of move on the earth like everybody else and not be creatures of briefing books and green rooms, and they're really coping with these sort of newfound restrictions and the newfound isolation of the White House. Another thing I wanted to mention is the sort of phenomenon of what happened to the Obama partnership and what happens to almost any partnership in the presidency. One of the really interesting things that happens to presidents and first ladies is that they get to the White House and they have to figure out how to take their marriage, and all of these marriages started off just like ordinary marriages like the rest of ours, and turn them into presidential partnerships. And in the Obama story, I think there are two particularly interesting twists. Mrs. Obama was never a typical political wife. She was never the kind of, sit in the first row and clap her way through the speech type. She was a professional woman. She earned more money than her husband for a lot of their careers. And she gets to the White House, and all of a sudden, she's in this funny position called First Lady. And, nobody can even decide whether First Ladyhood is really a job or not, because on the one hand, it clearly comes with a lot of responsibilities, but on the other hand, it's not something that you're elected for. It's not something that you can apply for. There is no pay for that job, as Michelle Obama has reminded school kids once or twice in discussing her role. And so the Obamas have to figure out sort of how to translate their partnership into a presidential partnership. And they each kind of have organizations to run. They have the East Wing and the West Wing. And there was considerable friction between the East Wing and the West Wing early in the Obama presidency. And, it's sort of like watching two people learn how to get along. These two organizations have to learn how to get along. And the issues ranged, from everything from the role that Mrs. Obama would play in the presidential message to debates about how the Obamas would look and live. Their personal choices were suddenly up for kind of political discussion, and there were sort of these quiet, muffled communications back and forth between the East Wing and the West Wing. A lot of it had to do with the economic climate that we're living in. The Obamas ran for the presidency in part because they wanted to be role models. They knew the power, the potential power of being the first African-American president and first lady. And Michelle Obama, when she got to the White House, really wanted everything to look very beautiful and sophisticated and chic. She knew exactly what the negative images were of African-American women, and that this was a rare opportunity to correct them on a very broad level. On the other hand, advisors like Robert Gibbs were really worried about the economic moment, and they were worried about the Obamas having a kind of, as he put it to me, John Edwards $400 haircut moment, worried that anything they did that looked too lavish, something out of the reach of ordinary Americans, could cause considerable political blowback. And so there was this, one of the things that kind of amazes me about White House reporting is how much friction there can be over things that are quite little. And so even things like whether the White House would announce the hiring of a new florist was debated between the East and the West Wings. And by the way, I feel that there's so much that I learned in the course of reporting for my book that applies to both Republicans and Democrats. And, the questions of how Mrs. Obama was decorating and entertaining and even dressing applied to so many women in in public life, because I think we see this over and over again with women who sort of shoot into the spotlight and are suddenly photographed 18 hours a day and want to look really good, and then often are hit with some sort of blowback for wanting to do so. The same thing to some extent happened to Sarah Palin in the 2008 presidential race when she got into trouble for shopping at Neiman Marcus. The other thing I wanted to mention about the Obama partnership is how potent it is politically. When the Obamas first got to the White House, Michelle Obama did have a fairly difficult landing. She was just a stranger in a strange world. She had never been the wife of a governor living in a state-owned mansion. As I mentioned, she was so newly confined. She didn't have, the kind of role in the presidential message that she sought. But I think that one thing that in a way, this is sort of, I think that the narrative that runs through the heart of this book is the story of her turnaround in the White House, the story of her really looking at the situation and saying, here's the power, here's the potential, here's how I can make the best of it. And, scene after scene and anecdote after anecdote, you really see her forge her own path and forge sort of a way of defining the role of First Lady, right? Because it's a bit of a blank slate. When she got there, she got a bunch of binders from Laura Bush's staff saying things like, you have to do the Christmas tree lighting around this date, and here's how you do the Easter egg roll. But there wasn't that much instruction or information on how to really on really how to make something out of First Ladyhood, and we see her step by step doing that herself. And there are some very interesting contrasts with her husband that emerge. One thing that I think is really telling is the fact that Let's Move, her childhood obesity initiative, emerged just as her husband was having a lot of trouble passing health care reform. And when you think about it, the Obamas have always had different approaches to sort of affecting change in society, if you look at them biographically. The president has always been a fairly traditional politician in that he's always sought to create change through legislative action. Mrs. Obama was always a skeptic about legislators. She saw, even when he served in Springfield, how good legislation was sort of stripped, overnight, or how it could become loaded with political pork. She never had a ton of confidence in the system, as she has admitted, and she always sought to change things through alternative means. So I think it's so telling that just as her husband was hitting major legislative roadblocks with health care reform, she devised Let's Move. When you think about it, the end results of Let's Move are not totally dissimilar from those of the health care overhaul, because if childhood obesity is eliminated, then we'll have less heart disease and less diabetes and lower health care costs and healthier Americans overall. But she's chose to go about it in a totally different way than her husband did. So one of the twists that I really discovered in my reporting was that she went from being sort of the odd person out in the White House, left feeling at the beginning that she didn't have a role in the presidential message, that she wasn't consulted on things. As you may have heard in the news, she was sometimes included in political bargains without her explicit permission. But things really changed for her in the White House, and the power dynamic shifted in part around the time of the 2010 midterm elections. She had been very reluctant to agree to campaign for midterms, in part because she didn't want to be used as a pawn. She wanted to be consulted, and she wanted to be part of a greater strategic plan for how the White House would campaign. So eventually, advisors held a meeting in the Oval Office in September of 2010 to, she had kind of agreed in theory to campaign, but hadn't fully committed. And so to me, it's a really fascinating scene because the Obamas are sitting there, and the Oval Office is, of course, the domain of the president, and yet this meeting is really for the First Lady. And one by one, advisors are coming, and they're presenting facts and figures and information. And what they're really talking about is the potency of the Obama partnership in the political field. I had interviewed the Obamas a year before, and I'd asked them, I asked them a pretty blunt question. I said, we see all of these beautiful images of the two of you together. Is there any way in which you're marketing your marriage for political gain? And they really pushed back on the question. They really resisted. Mrs. Obama said that, most of the images out there didn't come from them. They had been taken by other people, and they just sort of seemed to appear. Now, a year later, things were really different. The president's approval ratings were really far down, and Mrs. Obama was still incredibly popular. And so they were sort of explicitly told, Democrats like seeing you, Mr. President, but what they really like is seeing the two of you together. And there are PowerPoint presentations and whatnot supporting this information. So a few weeks later, I found out about that meeting later, but a few weeks later, I went to Philadelphia, where Mrs. Obama was campaigning in the midterms, and Philadelphia was plastered with posters of the Obamas together. And the posters seemed kind of funny to me because they said things like, vote for Joe Sestak, who was a Pennsylvania Democratic candidate, and yet they had these beautiful smiling pictures, kind of like that, of the Obamas together. And so part of what I think we see is really the transformation of the Obama partnership and the way the personal really, really does become political in the White House on almost every level. I stopped reporting the book in around August, and what was really striking to White House aides at the time is that they thought that, Mrs. Obama had become, in a way, kind of better adjusted to her role and her circumstances and her life in the White House than the president had, which was such a startling turnaround for me to see, because in my reporting, I had always experienced Michelle Obama as the reluctant one, the one who never wanted to run for the presidency, the one who never wanted a part of this life, who really did agreed to it because she didn't want to stand in her husband's way. And she had, and when she first arrived in the White House, the place just seemed so alien to her. And Barack Obama was always the ambitious one politically, the one who had thrown himself into this world. And yet by the summer, the First Lady had kind of created this successful world of her own with the Obesity Initiative, also Let's Move, also Joining Forces, which is her military families initiative. Joining Forces is very admired in the political world because it's considered very canny, because aside from the real merit of the project, it's kind of a Democratic takeover of a traditionally Republican issue, which is the military. She was all in for re-election. She was sort of bolstering her husband, completely ready to campaign. And really, it was the president who seemed to be more in a funk. Now, this is around the time of the debt ceiling crisis, and it's really the low point, I think, of the Obama presidency. Because here we have a president who rose to fame in 2004 by saying there's no red America, there's no blue America, there's only a United States of America. And such an appealing idea, right? Something that people really, really wanted to believe in. And yet, in the debt ceiling crisis, we saw that Washington was so polarized that he couldn't even get Republicans and Democrats to sit around a table to sort of hammer out a common sense solution, and ended up pretty much capitulating to a lot of the Tea Party's demands. And, at that point, advisors said that he was really frustrated in meetings. He knew that his support had really, really plummeted since 2008, that he had lost some of his connection to the American people. And I think it also gets to something that is really fascinating with this president and really important to remember, which is that he has a difficult relationship with politics. It's a paradox for us to have a sort of top politician in the country who has, kind of theoretical objections to politics. One of the most fascinating moments in the reporting to me was talking to his old community organizing boss in Chicago, a guy named Jerry Kelman, who went to a White House party right around the time that healthcare reform was being passed very painfully through the Senate. And Obama, at these White House parties, at some of them, the Obamas haven't really even mingled. They've kind of stood behind a rope. And the president saw Kelman at one of these parties and was so happy that he was there that he actually reached across the rope line and pulled him further in. And, that was the time when the administration was making deals in the Senate on health care that a lot of people questioned. It was the time of the Nebraska compromise that didn't really last because it looked like a giveaway to one state in exchange for a health care vote. And the president said to his old boss, Jerry Kelman, who taught him community organizing, he said, I'm still organizing. And Kelman said to me later, he almost didn't know what to say because it was so unusual to have a president of the United States who still, in some sense, thinks of himself as a community organizer. So as we come to the 2012 election, one thing that I will be watching as a reporter and that I want to ask all of you to watch as well is where we see both Obamas sort of moving now and how they're evolving. At the end of the day, my reporting really has been about the effect that power has had on these two people and the effect that living this very political life has had on them. And I think that there are two changes that we should really be watching for. One is that, as you will see on an almost daily basis, Michelle Obama is playing a much more important role in her husband's political message. A few weeks ago, he gave a speech at Fort Bragg about the end of the Iraq War, and there she was right up with him, giving remarks to introduce him. That's not something we would have seen at the beginning of the presidency. So I think the question we want to continue to watch is, to what extent is she kind of saving him politically, right? Because she is more popular than he is. And also, to what extent does that reflect a kind of private change in their partnership as well? She always kind of stayed out of politics, and has she moved more fully into it? The second thing I think we all need to watch is the extent to which the president kind of makes his peace with politics in this race. This is his last race. He'll never run another one. It's funny because he does still seem to sort of seek escape from it on some level. One of his close friends told me that he looks forward to his post-presidency whenever it comes, because at that point, Barack Obama will be able to, in some sense, move beyond politics and create real change, which struck me as such an Obama thing to say, right? I mean, if you can just sort of make it to the next level, that's when the real change will begin. But he has one last chance to be a great politician, to really connect with the American people, again, on a profound level, to not just argue that he's better than the alternative, but to come up with an affirmative, compelling, realistic vision why Americans should grant him 4 more years. I think it's way too early to say whether he's really done that effectively yet. As you may have seen in some of the recent pictures, he, to some degree, it's not that his campaign is inactive yet, but there is an element of sitting back and smiling and enjoying the Republican spectacle for now. But to me, that is the great sort of question in the Obama campaign with this last stage and this last story. Will the president and both Obamas finally resolve their relationship with politics in one way or another? And I will be watching along with you and reporting for the New York Times on the ending of that story. But right now, I am just happy to take your questions and have a real conversation with you guys about these two fascinating people. Thank you.
Well, I too am looking forward to questions. First of all, I think you can see that the answer that you gave on MSNBC was absolutely true. There is a lot that's new in this book and very insightful, so thank you so much for presenting that for us.
Thank you.
One question that I have is an observation made by a colleague of mine, Nancy Beck, in the First Lady's scholarship arena. She's written a book on Herbert Hoover's wife, Lou Henry Hoover. And Nancy commented that she thought that Americans' views of First Ladies are always about a generation behind where American ladies are in society. And I wondered if you thought that was true and if that's why professional and very accomplished First Ladies, before they come to the White House, such as Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama, have such difficult time and have maybe rough landings before they really find their voice.
Oh, I think there's, I'm just going to move this a little closer. I think there's definitely something to that. And, you know, it's funny because when, I mean, I should say, first of all, that, you know, the Michelle Obama that I discovered in my reporting is really impassioned about her husband's success, strong, as you say, you know, a really accomplished professional woman, has a really interesting and substantive critique of politics of her own, you know, really compelling ideas about social change and access and opportunity. And the thing that I think that's been so interesting in her public presentation is how much of that has been edited away. You know, the Michelle Obama the way she presents herself in public, I don't think is inaccurate at all. All of the first mom stuff I believe to be very accurate through my reporting. You know, her genuine warmth, her skills at connecting with people, her commitment to both the childhood obesity and the Military Families Initiative. I think that's very true to who she is, but I think there's also a lot that's been edited out that I did report in the book. I mean, you know, there are times in my reporting when I found that she is very frustrated or that she has a critique, but, you know, I was careful never to describe her as like irrational or meddling or manipulative, because that really wasn't the way aides and friends described her. Even aides, you know, in the West Wing who had some tension with her never described her that way. And I think that part of when you mentioned her comments on CBS and some of the other concern about the way she was portrayed, I think that in a way, part of what we're dealing with is a slightly inaccurate idea about First Ladies, because they all have these very gracious public images, but you know, every First Lady has a lot of steel in her spine, because you don't get elected to the presidency unless you have a canny, watchful, hardworking, vigilant wife. And, you know, the funny thing is, by the standards of some First Ladies, you know, the Michelle Obama stuff that I uncovered in my reporting is pretty mild. To me, the funniest example of this is Barbara Bush, because as we know, she had such a grandmotherly image among the American public, and in private, she was nobody's baby. You know, she was extremely tough. She had a lashing, you know, in my reporting, Michelle Obama, I've never come across an instance where she like gives her husband's aides, you know, a tongue lashing or anything like that. I found a lot of times when she was concerned about their performance, but other First Ladies, you know, have been known for dressing down their husband's aides, you know, to their face. And so I think that some of it has to do with the time lag that you describe in terms of generational change and where women are in society. And then I think part of it has to do with this kind of idealized images that we have and that sort of every White House promotes.
Great. Jodi, thank you. Before we get to our audience questions today, we have a question that's come to us from Facebook. And it goes beyond the First Lady and the President to the first children. Mm-hmm. The question is this: are the Obama daughters on Facebook or Twitter. Did issues about their privacy with regard to social media come up at all when you were researching for and writing this book?
I believe the answer is that privacy is a concern. I mean, I can't give you a sort of like up to the moment update of which sites they may or may not have used, in part because we don't really report directly on the first kids as many of you know. But I think that privacy concerns have been an issue at every level with those kids, and I can give you a couple of examples. When the Obamas moved into the I think one of the interesting things about the White House is that it's not really like an American home, like we think of as a sort of, regular modern American home. There isn't like an eat-in kitchen with a big island where the family can sit around. There's no private entrance or exit. Which makes it a slightly unusual place to live, and if you have young kids, the challenges are quite formidable. An initial concern, which relates to privacy, is that when the Obamas first moved in, an issue was just whether the girls could run around the house, because they have, kind of the private residence that, of course, they have free reign in, but then there's the larger house and campus of the White House, and it was a real conundrum because on the one hand, the Obamas wanted their kids to have freedom of movement. This is their home after all. But on the other hand, if they ran into tour groups, I mean, you know what would happen, right? I mean, talk about Facebook and Twitter, the cell phone cameras would come right out. So that was the kind of concern they had to navigate from the start. Another fascinating thing I learned that's in the book is that the Obama administration did some very involved negotiations with the news media on how Malia and Sasha are covered. Robert Gibbs and various associates sat down for weeks of meetings with network executives, because TV is really the biggest concern for them, when the Obamas moved in. And there are very specific rules that you can read about in the book for when it's okay to take a photograph or video of Sasha and Malia and when it isn't.
Jodi, congratulations on your book, the success and the insights you provided. And speaking of insights, you started the talk today speaking about 4 things you discovered, and I only heard 3, and the 3 I heard were basically the isolation of being in the White House after post 9/11. Number 2 is the sort of stress on a marriage because of the duties and responsibilities associated with being in the White House for a couple, especially a couple like those 2 who were highly motivated and had good careers themselves. And third was the sort of the political, how they're getting over their heartburn of the political process, individually and together. But what was the 4th one?
Mrs. Obama's turnaround in the White House. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You're very easy to listen to.
Thank you.
You were very articulate. And if I caught you right, at my age, we don't catch everything all the time, so have a little mercy here. Barack came in more as a community organizer mentality and trying to wed that with being a politician. And Michelle is kind of alternate ways of making changes, and not too happy about the political normal process also. Well, some of us older people would see the difference between a politician and a statesperson or a statesman, a stateswoman. And of course, that means that the politician is interested in his self power and all that, and the party. And of course, statesperson is supposed to be for the good of the country and maybe for the world. Now, would you put those, I didn't see you mention that larger kind of term of statesperson or statesman or stateswoman, and maybe it's not in your...
Well, no, I absolutely can talk about that, because one thing that's really interesting about the Obamas' experience in the presidency is that they have often had an easier time abroad than they have in the U.S. One pattern I kept noticing in my reporting is that international trips have often allowed them to kind of be the Obamas of 2008 again, in a way that they almost can't here, because Americans, have lived with the ups and downs of the administration, on a day-to-day basis. Obviously the political environment is really polarized. Relationships with Republicans have been hugely difficult, and even with Democrats, both on the Hill and out in the country, often really contentious. And the Obamas periodically fly off to some other country and are not only given heroic welcomes there, but almost kind of return, to the Obama candidacy and to the original, to some of the things that really excited Americans about the president. And I'll give you what I think is the most telling example, which is that in the fall of 2009, as you remember, the president was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And as you also may remember, the White House's reaction was like, it was a little awkward, right? He had just been elected president a year before. Things were not going particularly well at home. And for him to be given this huge honor and, feted in Scandinavian fashion was a little bit not the message they wanted to send home. So they actually had to negotiate with the Nobel folks, because normally Nobel winners are feted for days and days on end with concerts and meals and ceremonies, and the administration really cut back their trip to 26 hours, I believe, because they wanted to limit, the images of Obama sort of celebrating in that fashion. And so the Obamas and their contingent, not only a bunch of White House advisors, but also friends and relatives, went over there on this very brief trip. And lo and behold, it was like kind of the equivalent of a presidential dream sequence. One of the advisors told me, it wasn't hero worship. Okay, it was. Because, it was the kind of atmosphere where all these Scandinavians had read Dreams from My Father. He was trying to pass health care at home. They couldn't fathom why America, such a wealthy country, could allow so many millions of Americans to be uninsured. And it was a chance for Obama to play the sort of historic figure on the world stage, right? I mean, the Nobel Peace Prize is the domain of people like Martin Luther King Jr., and he was allowed to kind of stand in the shoes of those predecessors. And and they ended up really enjoying the trip, because it was such an edifying alternative to what was happening at home. So I think the contrast between that and the kind of raucous, really difficult politics they faced at home is really telling.
Given the acknowledged skills and talents of Mrs. Obama, do you think it possible that after a second term she might pull a Hillary Clinton and enter politics herself?
I'm on record, and I'll state it again tonight, that if Michelle Obama ever runs for public office, I will eat every page of my book. I seriously, I think it's out of the question. I mean, I can't tell you how intense and deep her kind of reluctance to enter public life was. I think one presidential advisor once told me, if you asked Michelle 100 times if she wanted her husband to run for president, I don't know that she would have said yes once. She really did it for him because she didn't want to be the one to stop him. There's another funny story from Chicago. One of her old bosses once told me that she used to say that the only thing she liked about, and this was earlier, this was around the time of his ascent in Illinois politics, she used to say that the only thing she liked about campaigning was that she got to see strangers' living rooms and she could pick up decorating tips. So, I think part of what's interesting is that we've seen somebody who, despite that original kind of allergy to politics has really mastered so many parts of it and acclimated herself to it. But whether she would ever run for office, I think is highly, highly, highly unlikely.
My question follows up on that. I've read various writers have said that Michelle, a point of real conflict between Michelle and the president was she did not want him to seek the presidency. Is that your understanding? And I guess more importantly, do you think she's come to terms with it? Do you think, on balance, she thinks the experience for her husband and the country is now, does she now look at it as a positive experience? My
understanding is that the decision for him to run for president really, really weighed on her. I think that one thing that's often lost in the telling that's really important to remember is that this was a pretty fast decision, right? Because Obama, around sort of June 2006 is still telling people that it's pretty much out of the question. And then it's by the fall of 2006 that he begins to signal that it's something he may consider doing. But there was a tremendous amount of pressure on him to make a decision quickly because Hillary Clinton was, as we know, the giant of the field. And, he had nothing. He didn't have a campaign organization. He hadn't raised money. And so he needed to really start immediately. In the middle of this, you have Michelle Obama, who did not want her husband to run, thought that he would benefit from waiting another couple of years, was especially concerned about attacks from the Clinton side of things. Her friend and former chief of staff, Susan Scher, just described it to me as, the decision weighing on her because she wasn't sure that it was the best thing for her family. And yet she really did believe in his potential as president. Also, remember that what people were telling Obama at the time was that you only get one shot like this. The window is closing and, it's your time. And so you have to run now. So who knows? We'll never know whether that was exactly right or not. But think about the kind of intense pressure it creates. As far as whether she's come to terms with it, I certainly can't read her mind, but all of my reporting has really indicated that she has. And I think that one thing that's especially interesting is, not only does she defend her husband so avidly, the last scene of the book is a toast she makes to him at his 50th birthday party, which happens during the worst week of the presidency. It's when the debt ceiling crisis has just climaxed and the credit downgrade is about to happen. And she really rallied him and bolstered him. But the other thing I think every time I see her out there speaking, she's beginning to fundraise. She hasn't campaigned on a large scale yet, but she will, is that, this race, the 2012 race, her campaigning and fundraising is essentially the only way she can get back at the Republicans who she feels have stymied her husband as president. And so, just an observer, I have to think that has something to do with how fully she's throwing herself into it.
You were given great access to both of them and to the White House. Did you pick them or did they pick you? And were there aspects of your reporting that reassured them? Were there any restrictions placed on you? Did you have to negotiate with Mr. Gibbs or other people? Or did you put restrictions on yourself? And was there ever a time when they felt that you had crossed the line, and did they ever censor you, in other words?
Those are great questions. First of all, I would say the New York Times picked me, first of all. In late 2006, I had lunch with Jill Abramson, who's now the editor of the paper, and she said, "You dropped out of Harvard Law School. Why don't you figure out what the deal was with Obama as Harvard Law Review president?" And that's when I started writing about him, and I contributed to a series that we do every 4 years and that I hope you're reading now, called The Long Run, which is the New York Times' biographical series of stories on the presidential candidates, really delving into their lives and looking at the experiences that have prepared them or not prepared them to become president. And we really, in those stories, we really look at the whole person. You know, we don't just look at sort of their resumes and work histories. We look at their relationships, attitudes, religious beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. As I began to report my way through Obama world, I would say, you know, I got to know the Obama's advisors and friends better and better. I was always very clear with them about what they were doing, what I was doing, and what my lines of inquiry were, both first for the paper and then for the book. They did cooperate with the book quite heavily, and I did get that big interview with the Obamas before in 2009. You know, sometimes people declare things off the record, which is fine, you know, and ask you not to publish things, and that's generally something we observe. You know, sometimes that can be a little bit of a negotiation, but when somebody tells you something is off the record, you know, you pretty much go by it. And I wouldn't consider that, you know, any kind of censorship. And no, in the course of reporting this book, I don't think any of them said to me, I really hope you don't write about such and such, or I really hope you avoid this in this area. And I should also say that I fact-checked the book very thoroughly before publication. The White House knew what was in this book months ahead of time. And so nobody said to me at that point either, there's something wrong with what you're doing here. Does that answer your questions?
Okay. They didn't see the manuscript.
No, because, you know, I did the book in New York Times style, which means that you don't really show people articles before publication. I think if you did, they would try to sort of edit it, and then that would be very awkward. But, you know, but I think there's also kind of a no surprises rule where you try to be very clear with people about what you're writing.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
You speak of the East Wing, West Wing polemics, and it seems like every administration sort of has that, particularly with the First Lady squaring off, and I'm wondering is Rahm Emanuel that dyad in this instance? Would that be the kind of the epitome of a pressure point?
That was one of the pressure
and
points.
Another.
Oh, yes.
Would you reflect on the rather contentious aspects that unfolded with the militant reverend in Chicago, and were the Obamas very chastened by that, kind of in the vis-a-vis the black church or black Christian connection? And lastly, a question about might be more for your publicist, since we're talking about the way things are perceived and put out there, but not that you intended it, but has the little bit of pushback from the First Lady been a boon on the book circuit and boosting your credibility in a way you might not intend?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I don't know if that's the case. I guess I found it puzzling for two reasons. One, because she said she hadn't read the book, and second of all, because I didn't think, and none of the people who read the book before publication, which was a diverse group of people, by the way, thought that we portrayed her as any kind of angry black woman. And the White House has since said that she was responding more generally to a perception that she doesn't like. And there was, by the way, some coverage of the book that was a little bit sensationalized, where it was actually strange for me as the author to see some of the reporting ripped out of context. As far as Jeremiah Wright goes, I did a lot of reporting on him back in the day of the early presidential campaign, and I think that the Obamas were chastened by what happened, but not in the way that you might expect. One real theme of my reporting and of the book is the question of what is public and what is private in political life and in office. And the thing that I think was ultimately so dramatic about that experience is that, initially Obama thought that Jeremiah Wright would be an asset to him in the campaign. He titled his second book, The Audacity of Hope, which was the title of a Wright sermon. He originally invited Wright to speak at the Springfield announcement, then reversed the invitation. But I think the thing that was very chastening for the Obamas was watching their church, Trinity in Chicago, turn into a complete zoo when this blew up. You know, I spent some time in that church, and the thing that I think was very difficult was watching a regular congregation, no matter what you think of the pastor's views, really become this object of national interest. And I'll just give you an example of sort of how out of control things can get. Many churches and synagogues, maybe some of yours, publish, bulletins where they list the names of elderly or infirm members so that people can, bring food or visit them or read to them or whatever. And members of the media were actually calling people on that list for information on Wright or Obama. Yeah, so I think that the church, your rank and file church members were just so horrified that this was happening in their place of worship. And for the Obamas, it was very sobering because they saw the kind of negative attention that they could attract to really any house of worship. And so, they haven't joined a congregation in Washington. They kind of dip in and out of any churches. But the political obstacles for them, and I think for other politicians as well, are becoming very formidable because, are you going to vet, the leader of the congregation for every single thing that he or she has ever said, and do you want to sort of bring all that baggage, right, to the congregation? Do you want to have your fellow congregants scrutinized in a way that may be very uncomfortable for everybody? And I have to admit that I forgot your third question. Oh, yeah, the Rahm Emanuel stuff. Well, okay, so this is one of the ways in which I tried to present Mrs. Obama with a lot of context, showing that her behavior was actually like a lot of other first ladies, that basically a lot of smart women have responded to some of the challenges of first ladyhood in the same way. And so there's a story I tell in the book about Rahm Emanuel promising Michelle Obama's presence at an event in Florida in exchange for a vote. There was Rahm Emanuel was trying to pass the energy bill through the House in the late spring, early summer of 2010, and he wanted the vote of a now former congressman, then congressman named Alan Boyd, who was a congressman from Florida. And Boyd would only vote yes on the energy bill if Michelle Obama, I know you're shaking your head, came down to do this event with him. What very few people knew, and what Michelle Obama did not know, is that Boyd, who is white, had a potential black challenger down in his district. So having Michelle Obama right down there, and she was never, according to her aides, she was never even told that. Her aides also did not tell her that Boyd was going to vote against health care reform, which is really the thing that she cared about. But so anyway, Emanuel makes the deal without consulting Michelle Obama. And when she finds out, she's really frustrated because she's been used as a bargaining chip without her consent. Now, the funny thing is, before I told that story in the book, like 3 paragraphs earlier, I told a very similar story about what happened when Rahm Emanuel committed then First Lady Hillary Clinton to a White House event without her knowledge and her reaction, which was not pleased either. So, I guess, if I could say something to the First Lady in response to what she said on CBS about my book, it would be to say, I really tried to present you in context and to, for example, this one time that I'm sort of representing you as, your aides said you were frustrated, I did the work of finding this very parallel Hillary Clinton story to show that there are other people in a similar position who reacted the exact same way.
This family is so private with respect to their faith. Could you share some insight, or were you able to gain any insight into the presence of faith inside the White House?
Well, it's funny because because of the experience we just talked about with Jeremiah Wright and Trinity Church, the question of whether the president will kind of share his faith has become a really fraught one. In the summer of 2010, things were just going terribly on every level in the White House. You know, Gulf oil spill, approach to midterm elections, a lot of internal infighting and dissatisfaction. And in the middle of this, to kind of like add insult to injury, a Pew poll came out that you may remember that said, I can't remember the exact number, it's in the book, but a very high and growing percentage of Americans thought that Barack Obama was a Muslim. And so it was like, people in the White House were almost incredulous because, not long ago there's been this scandal over the pastor at his Christian church, and now people are assuming, seem to think he's a Muslim. And so all that summer, Democrats on the outside, like kind of high-level Democratic consultants in Washington, were saying things like, put a Bible in his hand, send him to church. And I asked David Axelrod and other advisors, everybody is telling you that you've got to sort of have him showcase his religiosity much more. Are you considering doing it? And Axelrod and other advisors were like, that would not go over well with him. He really is allergic to, being told you need to do such and such for show. Now, granted, he does many things for show, as all politicians do. We see that coming out of the White House all the time. But it was really interesting to me that they were so resistant to that. I do think, however, that the president has found times to communicate his faith, and particularly, he has a real mastery of biblical stories and language, and a kind of oratorical style of the Black church that can be really effective. And he's found ways, I think, to employ it on his terms. Like if you remember the really beautiful speech he gave at the memorial service for the Tucson shooting victims. It was really one of the best moments of his presidency in terms of his ability to connect with the public. And I thought it was very interesting, and I wrote about it in the book, that at that moment he very effectively used religious language to capture what people were feeling.
Thank you, first of all, for your comments and for your book. I would be curious about the extent to which you could comment on the First Lady as an advisor to the President, if she has a particular niche insofar as policy matters are concerned, and I'd be particularly curious about her serving as an advisor on nominations, particularly nominations for the court.
I can tell you a little bit more about her sort of general role than about. We don't know that much about how she sort of, commented on very specific nominations. Although, I wouldn't be surprised if she is very happy that her husband. Actually, she said in public that she's extremely proud that her husband has appointed 2 women to the Supreme Court. But I think the more interesting answer is about her role as an advisor, and it's not really on specific policy matters. There are few to none examples of, Michelle Obama weighing in on a particular proposal saying, I've never heard a story of her bursting into the West Wing to say, public option or bust, on something like healthcare reform. But What did become very clear in my reporting is that she's sort of a guardian of the initial mission of the Obama presidency. She is sort of the person who carries the flag for the reasons he ran in the first place and the things that the American people expect of him. And interestingly, in the first few years of the administration, she really backed him when he wanted to do some ambitious but politically unpopular things like healthcare reform and immigration reform. And that is also in contrast to people like Rahm Emanuel, who were more conservative politically, more worried about things like midterm re-election results. She really wanted him to take political risks, to ignore what people in the White House often refer to as the Washington noise and the kind of political games, and to accomplish big things. She's always had a very lofty, transformative view of him as a leader.
Well, thank you, Jodi. Jodi mentioned to me this evening before she began that she was particularly pleased to be with us this evening at the Miller Center because of its unique understanding of and study of the presidency through our Presidential Oral History program and our Presidential Recordings program. But I think you will agree with me that we are pleased to have had her and her contributions to our knowledge of the presidency, the First Lady, and particularly the Obamas. So please join me in thanking Jodi.